Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the American Academy in Berlin. I'm Roger Cohen, columnist for the New York Times. I'm coming to the end of a 2.5-week stay here. And I'd just like to start by thanking Michael Steinberg and all the staff of the Academy and all the fellows who've been here with me for making my stay so rich and rewarding and interesting, and reminding me what a precious institution the American Academy is, particularly at this time of transatlantic difficulties and tension on some fronts. Well, close to 25 years ago, I was sitting in Sarajevo covering the Bosnian War. I'd been there for a couple of years. I'd been watching women and children get blown up before my eyes by Serbian artillery from the hills, and I'd written story after story about it, as had many of my colleagues. And I had despaired, as I think we all had, of any meaningful Western intervention, whether American or European or combined. We'd watched United Nations soldiers in their blue helmets being killed before our eyes, while NATO planes passed meaninglessly overhead. And it had become, frankly, grotesque. Western politicians were busy explaining how these were 1,000-year-old conflicts that couldn't possibly be resolved by Western governments, and that Slobodan Milosevic, the strongman of the Balkans, was invincible. And then arrived Richard Holbrooke, whose absolutely core role in the foundation of this institution you all know about, and we all thought, yeah, right, ain't gonna happen. And you know what? In a very short space of time, really a few months, with a combination of tough diplomacy backed by force, Richard Holbrooke compared diplomacy to jazz, improvisation on a theme. The war was brought to an end. And not another shot, and we should remember that tonight, however difficult, however problematic, however complicated the situation in the Western Balkans is, not another shot was fired in anger in the Balkans. And the 100,000 dead, not another 100,000 were added to those who'd already died in the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. But on many fronts, things have not gone that well. There was a hope that all the Western Balkan states would join the European Union, might join NATO. You have some dysfunctional states or semi-functional states, a lot of corruption, a lot of cronyism, a lot of issues. And that's what we're here to discuss tonight, because we know the cost of negligence, we know the cost of turning the other way when there are problems. And to discuss all this and talk about a possible new Balkan diplomacy, I'm joined by a very distinguished panel, starting on the right here with Ambassador Wolfgang Ischinger, former German ambassador to the United States, among other important roles he has played. Ambassador Frank Wisner, who has followed the Balkan, former ambassador to India, who has followed the Balkan story for a long time now. To my left, Genoveva Ruiz Calavera, who is really the European Union czar, I would say, on all questions Balkan. And finally, Minister Alexander Andrija Pejovic, who is the Minister for European Affairs in Montenegro. And Alexander, perhaps I can start with you as the one representative from the region here. It seems to me we're stuck in a difficult quandary, because the Balkan states really see their future stability, prosperity, and so on in eventual European Union membership. At the same time, you have a European Union that is weary, that is skeptical of enlargement, that has been through the trauma of Brexit, and whose appetite for further expansion is extremely limited. So what is the answer? If the path into Europe looks closed, what will be the effect of that?
Yes, Roger. I mean, you put it properly in a way that there are two processes. One is that every country in the Western Balkans wants to join the EU. I mean, it's a binding tissue that actually connects everybody in the Balkans, unlike maybe the NATO one, which is not shared by all the countries. But here, the EU is not just the binding factor. It's also the kind of impetus, that it's also kind of a reason to reform and actually to engage in a sort of sometimes a very painful process of changing the situation in the countries. And it's sometimes a top-down process. I mean, the elites are imposing a sort of changes and reforms that are happening, but sometimes it's a bottom-up, because also the people want the change and the people want to join the EU, and they are pressing the political elites through the elections or through other ways, actually to engage in all sorts of reform processes. On the other hand, as you rightly put it, there is the kind of diminished appetite for the enlargement within the member states. And this kind of fatigue, I remember that the previous commissioner, Mr. Füle, expressively prohibited us to use the word fatigue, enlargement fatigue.
What did he want you to use instead?
He said there was no fatigue with the enlargement, but already at the time of the previous...
They were just tired.
At the time of the previous commission, it's something that you could feel that there is a kind of the first awakening with the Big Bang enlargement, the consequences of now enlarged union with the 28, first the 20, of course 27, and then Croatia, and you could feel that there is a feeling of let's now have some time to see how this functions, because it was really enlarged. It was different kind of a meeting atmosphere in the EU rooms, and then to decide what to do with the Western Balkans. This commission started with the president of the commission's message, no enlargement during this term in office until 2019. And that was a kind of message that produced lots of different reactions in the region. It has not benefited those political elites that are fighting for the enlargement and for the
Are people in the region themselves getting tired of the idea
of course,
joining the EU, a bit like Turkey has over time lost its appetite?
There is a kind of also a fatigue with integration, because sometimes when you constantly invest in what's happening, and I'm talking not just about the people but also the elites and the political parties, that you feel this sort of fatigue. But I think that what we have to bear in mind is that now the latest surveys, the Eurobarometer survey showed 68% of the Germans thinking that enlargement is a negative policy, or 72% of the Austrians, and we are now running into Austrian elections. So this is something that we also have to take into account when thinking about how the EU is going to approach
So
this.
that leads me to Genevieve. What's in it for the EU to expand into the Western Balkans when the idea is unpopular with a huge number of Europeans? What's in it for you? I mean, how do you, presumably you want to achieve this, so what case can you make?
Well, I think the first thing I would like to mention what Minister was saying, the importance of the work we're doing together in the European Union, the Western Balkans, of course with the support of our transatlantic partners, is that we're working on the transformations on countries that have been at war. Mm-hmm. And this is a very different shape of what we had done before. Mm-hmm. We have brought countries that needed to transform from communist regimes, but here we're working with countries that have been at civil war with each other. So I think the timing of all this has a different scope and a different magnitude. But as you rightly said, first we have to be very proud that in the last years we have not seen not only any of these episodes happening, but we have seen a very positive component of the countries working together in the region to make sure that they get closer to the European Union. And first and foremost is because those transformations that we want to do in the Balkans is good for the people. Whether they come next year or the year after next, what the people in the Balkans is asking is they want predictability, they want security, they want the rule of the law, they want, of course, economic growth. They want as well our values in terms of freedom of expression, capacity to move, and all that they wanted whether they are in the European Union or not, but they want that first. And it's very important that we realize that in doing that, of course, it's important for the European Union. You look at the geography. I mean, it's just clear. I mean, this is not just the backyard. This is just an enclave inside the European Union after our enlargement. And as Commissioner Hunt put it, it is in the EU interest to export stability to this region before we import instability. But I would not like to look at the Western Balkans only as a security threat. I think we have to look at the Western Balkans as an opportunity for the European Union as well.
In what sense?
I mean, first and foremost, we have 6 countries which are in different levels, but they are pro-European. I mean, it is very interesting to see. You go in Albania, you go in Montenegro, many countries of the region, the youth, the level of interest that there is. I mean, they are much better informed about what's happening in the European Union than our own youth. The second, which is, I think, is absolutely motivating for me when I engage. So I would like to engage with my nephews in such deep debates about visa liberalization like I have in Kosovo with your youth. The second issue, which is very important, is that if you look at the priorities for the European Union for the future, of course we need, we're talking about the One Belt, One Road policy of China. We have our own connectivity agenda, which goes through the Western Balkans. If we want to have energy security and energy diversification, we have to go through the Western Balkans. If we want to increase...
meanwhile, Europeans are worried about refugees coming the other way.
Yes, and I think Europeans have seen the very positive role that the Western Balkans have taken in this migration crisis. The first countries that helped us manage this migration crisis were in the Western Balkans, even more than our own member states in many respects. So I think this is the important message I want to take. Of course, the Western Balkans have to do a lot of work and difficult work on those reforms. But I think the EU has to see, and I hope that there will be a joint endeavor, that there are opportunities for the EU to have the Western Balkans in.
Frank, could I bring you in here? How interested is the Trump administration in the Balkans?
Roger, you know, if I knew the answer to that, you would regard me as some form of seer. I'm not.
I do.
I will.
I do, Frank.
I will at least.
I have for a long time.
I'll at least try to give you some ways of thinking.
Yeah.
You know, in all honesty, the United States has never been an eager partner to the problems of the Balkans. I remember very clearly after the blow-up of the former Yugoslavia, it was with the greatest diffidence that Jim Baker looked at George Bush in the day, George H.W. Bush, and said, I don't think we need to go there. That's really a European problem. Well, we learned it wasn't.
We ain't got a dog in this fight.
We haven't got a dog in this fight. And the subsequent administration found that we had lots of dogs in the fight. But once the fight was carried forward with a lot of American participation and responsible American participation, gradually improved, we then began to relax a bit. So that the logic that I believe in, and that I wish I could share with all of my fellow countrymen, is that any casual reading of world history says the Balkans is a center of instability if it is not contained in a greater and more stable whole. It was for centuries in the Ottoman grip and followed beyond that briefly by the Austrians. But the Balkans without a definition is a serious danger to Europe. Europe's stability and freedom and security is a primary American responsibility. So it's not a direct but an indirect American interest. And here I think it's going to be tough to make a big case in the United States under this administration. It was under Obama to fully and deeply engage the United States. Now, does that mean we don't have to do anything? Of course not. We have troops in the region. We have active diplomats who are fully engaged in these matters. One of them sitting here in our midst, Hoyt Yee. We have just seen the Vice President travel to your country, to Montenegro, and make a very strong statement. We're very sensitive to the intrusion of the Russians. We're not blind to the destabilizing effects of an untethered Balkans. But how is this all going to play out?
Could I just ask one?
I think, just to finish that very quick thought, I think much is going to depend on the way Europe puts her hands around this problem. And then comes to us and we reform the partnership. And I believe the partnership's essential.
You've alluded to the stability and peace and prosperity of a Europe whole and free that has been underwritten by the United States for so long. Clearly, if out of the White House emerges consistent disparagement of the core institutions behind that, that's to say NATO and the European Union, it sends a certain message to all of Europe, not only to the Balkans. How serious do you think that is?
Well, it's counterbalanced. I had the privilege of sitting in, Wolfgang, your conference in Munich right after the administration came to office, and the Vice President, Secretary of Defense, and a number of our major national leaders, followed then by the President, all restated core American commitments. Now,
well, the President didn't restate it in Brussels. He removed it from his speech.
He then dropped it later.
Yeah.
But nothing...
Yeah, in a meeting with some, I don't know where he was from.
Right. Look, I'm not going to... I'm not here tonight to sit in a debate about American politics. As you can imagine, I think yours and my politics are rather similar. But what I am saying is that I've seen no set of decisions taken by this administration which go to the heart of our transatlantic defense alliance. Now, it could. I'm not going to rule that out. I watch with keen worry next week the decisions on Iran. But
which I think could go badly.
I think there are a number of balancing voices as this administration seeks to get its feet under it that mean we recognize the value, importance, indeed vital necessity of our European security ties.
Wolfgang, clearly a Europe that is lacking self-confidence is not going to be well placed to address the issues and aspirations in the Balkans. We had a very ambitious, bold speech from Emmanuel Macron, the French president, just recently. And of course, we've had an election in Germany, which we'll see Angela Merkel continuing as chancellor, at least for a period. Do you think the European Union at this point is capable of the kind of refondation, revival that Emmanuel Macron outlined, and that would give it the impetus to be able to even contemplate bringing in countries beyond Croatia, which has already joined, to the European Union? And what role can Germany play in that?
Well, Roger, I'm not, at this point, pessimistic. I tend to be more on the optimistic side, not least because of what you just quoted. We appear to have, once again, a credible and capable and determined partner in Paris. That's probably a huge asset. Second, and that is more on the negative side, of course, as Chancellor Merkel said a few months ago, in this wonderful suburb of Munich called Trudering, apparently we can't rely, as we used to do, that we'll always be bailed out when push comes to shove. In other words, we seem to find ourselves in a situation where we need to do more ourselves, and we can't outsource.
Do you agree with that?
Our security concerns to the...
Do you agree with that?
I agree with it as a positive incentive.
Yeah.
I don't agree with it if people interpret it as, okay, let's disassociate ourselves from the US, because I think we will continue to need totally, regardless of Trump, a close transatlantic relationship. Leaving that aside, let's step back a moment. I mean, just to outline for some of the people in this room who probably weren't even born when Richard Holbrooke and I and a number of others in this room went to Dayton in '95. let's not forget that the myth which many in Europe have held for a long time, that Europe, with the end of the Cold War, was now a stable and peaceful place. That is totally wrong. We have had, since 1990, the emergence of more new nations on the European continent than any other region in the world except the decolonization period in Africa in the post-1960s. When I last looked, it was like 15 new nations. I mean, you know, former Soviet republics, Yugoslavia alone,
Catalonia.
Yugoslavia alone, and unsettled business in places like Spain and a number of other countries. Why do you think there were 5 countries which, even though I worked hard with Frank when we did the Troika negotiations to find a solution to Kosovo in 2007, we did our best to convince the entire membership of the EU that, you know, that we should have a unified EU position. Why do you think 5 countries of the EU refused to accept the idea of Kosovo independence? Not because they dislike Kosovo, or because they had a problem with the future president of Kosovo. Not at all. They had a problem with their own irredentist, separatist movements in their various countries. That was the reason, and that is still, as we look at Scotland, Catalonia, and a number of other issues of that nature in Europe. In other words, what I'm trying to say is, contrary to what the myth of Europe as a stable and peaceful continent has tried to present, we have gone through an extremely turbulent period of the last 25 years. And we should be thankful that at this moment there is a perspective of continued stable government in this country as one of the founding and more important members of the European Union. We will have, it's easy to predict, we will have largely foreign policy continuity. We will continue to be pro-EU. We will continue to be pro-NATO, more or less, pro-NATO. So there will not be significant change. That's good when you look at all the rather hectic changes that are happening in various other parts.
Why did you say pro-NATO, more or less?
Well, there are some people in some of the political parties that might form this coalition who might have who might represent slightly different variants of support for, let's say, nuclear weapons or other elements of NATO policy. But this is minor stuff.
Yeah.
You know, on a strategic level, this country is going to be okay. But, and the point, this is my final point, I think that what might really be the game changer here for Europe as a whole, but also in particular for the problem we're discussing here, namely the future of the Western Balkans and how we deal with enlargement and how we deal with the individual countries, is if we can recreate a sense of unity of purpose and cooperative partnership in leadership between Paris and Berlin, I think that is, I don't want to use words that are too large, but I think that is really almost a historic opportunity. And I'm quite confident that this opportunity that both here in Berlin and in Paris, people are eager to explore this opportunity. Hopefully we'll have a government soon, hopefully before Christmas. And then, you know, let's see how far we can take this.
Do you expect to see a new EU member from the Balkans in the next 5 years?
Why not? But, it's an important but. I happen to be...
Alexander is laughing.
I happen to be not a friend of an approach to EU membership that creates more divisions than necessary within the Western Balkans. I find it unacceptable. I found it unacceptable that all of a sudden certain people in countries in the region needed, you know, a passport or even a visa to go to neighboring countries. In other words, we need to make sure that our enlargement policy tries to do the maximum possible in treating the six as a group that needs to be respected as a group. And
So all in or none in?
well, no, not necessarily like this, but with the maximum respect for the interests of this group. My perfect, I know this is unrealistic, but the perfect vision would be that all of them would engage in the closest possible regional cooperation. This is an old recipe. I mean, at the origin of the European Union was close Franco-German, Belgian, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and Italian cooperation on certain areas of industry and business. And on that basis, we created institutions. So I would be extremely happy if I heard that, you know, all of a sudden, Montenegro, Serbia, Kosovo, Macedonia would get together, would get their act together and come to the EU and say, here we are, we want to be members. And we will get rid of the internal problems ourselves.
Well, Genevieve, I mean, far from that, there are people talking about the Serbian-Kosovo confrontation as possibly leading to another war within the next 5 years. And there's a perception in the EU that, I mean, a little bit like when I was covering the war, that the Balkans are kind of bad news. You know, is there something, and the war was brought to an end by leadership, do you see any possibility of real leadership from Belgrade and Pristina that, I mean, imagine if the Serbs and Kosovars worked it out, and suddenly we had a sort of Colombia-like example in Europe of a very fraught, difficult situation being resolved by the actors on the ground, possibly with your help or EU help. So is that possible or totally unthinkable? And could borders be changed to achieve that?
Okay.
I'll just throw in that last little
The last I am going to say it is possible because we have the commitment of those two parties into this issue to make it happen.
Yeah.
And I certainly, we have a renewed commitment, and I am convinced, and this is, of course, the high representative of the Common Foreign Security Policy, Federica Mogherini, that will continue to engage together with those partners, because we are not imposing, we're just facilitating, we're not even mediating. We're facilitating a dialogue that is happening already at the highest level of those. Now has been renewed. We have.
Vucic has proposed, you know, give us that little corner of mainly Serbian-populated territory, and we'll forget our claims to the rest of it. Is that something that could be entertained?
I haven't seen that proposal. I mean, Vucic has just launched an internal dialogue on this matter. Yeah. And in the context of that internal dialogue, there are already discussions between both parties, and I see the president smiling. So that proposal is not on the table. But I agree with you that really getting to it...
But it's in the atmosphere.
It can be in the atmosphere, but I think what is important is that the discussions have to be happening between both parties.
Sure.
And what I think is very important as well is that those discussions take place in the best possible conditions. It's not only good news for the people of Kosovo and for the people of Serbia, it's good news for the people of the whole region and good news for the European Union. So we all have a lot of expectations and a lot of support.
How worried are you of a renewed conflict there on that?
I am not worried of renewed conflict at all.
And what would you put the chance, if there's no progress toward membership of the European Union over the next decade and Russia continues to try to be disruptive, what are you worried that, I said at the beginning, no further shots have been fired in anger. Are you worried that could cease to be true?
Look, the first thing that I think I disagree is that there will be progress in the European Union in the next 10 years. And we see it already. We see it clearly. And I think it's very important, in line with what Ambassador Ischinger was saying. You know, today we have a very successful regional cooperation process, which was launched under the auspices of Chancellor Merkel, which is the so-called Berlin process, in which former enemies sit around regularly now at prime minister and presidential level to discuss together how to move the region forward towards the European Union. And in that seat, you have the president of Kosovo and the president of Serbia sitting together and walking together and having dinner together and discussing together. So this is happening already today, and it's happening very successfully. And that really demonstrates that the region understands that working together gets them individually closer to the European Union. I am convinced that it can happen, but I don't have the date, because the date belongs to the countries that are in this process.
Alexander, if you could have a wish list of 3 or 4, and I want you to be very concrete here and very practical, what could the European Union put to your countries that would help make the case for moving forward on European Union membership, and would give hope to the citizens of the region that this is a process that's moving? Turkey has been trying to join the European Union since 1963, and there's been a process that's now a process, a bit like the Middle Eastern peace process between Israel and Palestine, that's been going on for 50 plus years. And it could happen in your case. So what, practically speaking, would you like to see?
Well, the wish list would definitely contain the horizon or the perspective, because this is something that is not just needed from our side, but I think also that the EU needs some sort of a strategic or visionary approach to how it is going to deal with the next member states. And also we are talking now this in the light of Brexit, because we are having 2 processes going on. By 2019 we are going to lose 1 member state, but at the same time we have to look beyond the next European parliamentary elections and also the next Commission. So what I would wish for is definitely that the next Commission, the next Parliament, engage very strongly within the sort of, I would say, constructive and structural perspective for the countries of the Western Balkans. We agree that the membership is something that awaits all of us in the Balkans, and we just need to find a structural framework how to achieve it, and that entices also the date. And I think also that the kind of message sent through the speech of President Juncker in Strasbourg was the first step towards that goal. And then the strategy that should come out this winter from the Commission on how to deal with the Perspective 2025, which touches upon the wider vision of the European Commission, how to deal with Europe, is crucial. So to have the next 8 years devising how to bring the countries closer, and those countries that can manage. I feel that the individual merit-based approach, which stems from Thessaloniki agenda and the commitments, should be the only, let's say, procedure to be applied. If
Montenegro can get in alone, that's fine by you?
Yeah, I mean, and this has been the case in some of the enlargements, not in all. We can think about the Big Bang enlargement, but let's take the latest enlargement, NATO enlargement. It was individual merit-based approach. And
so how important for you psychologically is it that Montenegro is now a member of NATO?
It's crucial, you know.
Why?
It brings on several levels.
How does it change your feeling about yourself?
First of all, you know, when the country became independent in 2006, the whole idea was to achieve 2 primary foreign policy goals. One is NATO, the other is the EU. So we achieved one. It's one step into the stability and security, but also it's
stability and security.
Stability and security, which also cherishes very much the investment and the financial climate where the country feels secure.
So when there's an attempted coup by Russia, it doesn't trouble you too much?
No. That's another issue. But just to say that
no, it's not. It's a linked issue.
No, I'll come back. Yeah. But also in Montenegrin case, what I wanted to say is connected with the issue of a country that feels that through NATO and the EU, it will strengthen its sovereignty, its independence, because there will be a wider framework through which it can, as the smallest member of the Western Balkans, or the Balkans itself, can actually enhance its position. And of course, the Russian intervention, the Russian involvement in the happenings, I feel just showed how necessary this is, that the process goes on. Because if you leave the region open to the intrusion of the third actors, not just the Russians but the others, then you get what you get. I mean, you get these kind of intrusions, you get this instability which is instigated, and you get also new scenarios, new alternatives. And you get new calls for changes of the borders, new nationalism, and everything that actually is very much common to the region. But to continue just the other 2 wishes that I have It's definitely, we feel that the countries would need also, apart from getting a sort of a fixed or a structural approach on how they could join, a sort of the opening of the structural funds, of the cohesion funds. Meaning that at this stage, most of the countries in the Balkans are acting as member states in many policies. And because the process is now taking so much longer than what it was in the 90s for the Eastern European countries, obviously it is a big strain on the resources, on financial resources. And therefore opening up to the region, which has started through the Berlin process and the infrastructure investment, meaning for the first time the region is not a gray area. We have our corridors, our routes, we are firmly embedded in trans-European networks, and now we can draw the funding for that. But that should also hold for the cohesion money, like also agricultural, common agricultural policy, and also the European social
So you want
funds.
money?
The money which would actually help the reform. No, but look, these are the reforms that have taken root, and they need financial resources to continue to become sustainable, because you cannot expect these countries to be perfect in all the senses without being helped. And this is just the case that has been done in the recent enlargements. We're not asking anything more than the other countries. Of
Well,
course,
it could encourage a culture of dependency, which wouldn't be good for you guys, maybe. Anyway, I'd like to bring, thank you, I'd like to bring in Frank at this point. You were talking this afternoon about flexibility, and maybe a maximalist approach is not necessary or needed, that the European Union has great difficulties with the idea of enlargement right now, and the countries in the region need positive signals about coming close to Europe. But maybe they don't have to actually join the European Union. There can be some kind of halfway house. Could you talk about that a little, Frank?
Well,
I mean, I suspect in the region it might set some alarm bells ringing, but...
Well,
Yeah.
first I have to offer a word of apology. To have an American talking to Europeans about how to structure invitations into the European Union is odd. I can only say I can think, I can listen, and can reflect on the choices that come to mind when you look at a tough issue like the one you're facing at the moment. If you'll accept my thought, and with that caveat, I'd be very grateful. When, as it is classically the case in diplomacy, you face an issue that is really difficult, and the choices you're given is, here's a rule book, you've got to follow that rule book every step of the way, or you do nothing. You can be absolutely certain there will be no progress. So I like the minister's word. He used the word flexibility.
He did?
He did. And,
Really?
Did.
I missed
that. I heard it. But if you start with the thought that Europe is the destination, there's a vision shared by Europeans and the nations of the Western Balkans in general. And that vision is that these are European nations, part of Europe. Their security is the security of Europe. Then you've made an important step. Just how you execute on that step, you can think of a variety of different ways to put it into effect. What did I just hear? I heard from the minister several ways. If you state the vision, where this train is headed, then there are a lot of way stations. There's agricultural development, there are open markets, there are infrastructure developments that open markets for European sales into the region, as well as exports from the region out. There are political concepts. There are a whole raft of undertakings, while at the same time you're engaging in the laborious practice of chapter by chapter. And in each step, including circular movement of workers, starting in one country, spending some months in another country, coming back home again. It has to be, our imaginations have to have some scope where we can figure out ways to accomplish the same objective using more flexible techniques. And
But to which these countries might respond, we want stability, and the only way to have stability is to be in inside the club, inside the EU, inside NATO. Look where President Putin has made trouble. He's made trouble in the in-between lands, in Ukraine, in Georgia. Why hasn't he gone into Estonia or Latvia? Because they're in the club, or Poland. So they might say, it's all very well to be flexible, but we need the firm contours of the EU and the alliance.
Well, again, it comes back to a question of vision,
Yeah.
and how clear and crisp Europe is in saying we're on a road, there's the destination,
Right.
and there are many ways we can travel that road to get there. But I believe, and I'm speaking again for myself, that Putin's success in entering the Balkans is being done on the cheap. He's being very disruptive, and the reason he's being successful with odd intrusions like peacekeeping centers in Nish and a couple of MiG airplanes and some propaganda, these things are the result. He looks much stronger than he is. Why does he look stronger? Because we aren't speaking clearly.
No.
We haven't given the region a sense of where it's headed. And
We, you
therefore,
mean Europe mainly?
I mean Europe mainly, but I also mean.
Would you
that
say this
Europe-
is 90% a European problem?
I'm not going to try to pull numbers because there are different aspects. There's NATO as well, and there's more of an American contribution. I believe this is primarily a European matter, but I believe it's more successful, and it's a fundamental American responsibility as well. So when I say we, I mean Europe, and I mean the United States. And if we know where we're headed and are clear about it, and communicate it to our own people and to the Balkans, then Putin's ability to maneuver in the Balkans is vastly reduced.
Wolfgang, I was struck this afternoon when the former president of Kosovo, who is sitting here tonight with us, said movingly that Europe has a historic obligation, I think were the words she used, a historic obligation toward the Balkans, which is something I felt very strongly when the Cold War came down, that the West had a historic obligation to the nations that had been sold down the river at Yalta. A lot of my colleagues at the New York Times disagreed with me. But so what do you, is Europe tired of historic obligations?
Roger, on a more fundamental note, I would be much less pessimistic and far more optimistic about the current state of play of the European Union. It is true that the European Union was primarily occupied with itself ever since 2008, with the financial crisis and with Greece and the euro, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I find it interesting that most of my, not you, not the two of you, but many of my Anglo-Saxon friends have not understood and seem to be surprised when I tell them that last year the European Union produced more growth than the United States. Yes. Did you know that? They don't know this. I think the European Union is in good shape. Maybe not in as good a shape as we want it to be, but certainly in much better shape than it was for the last 8 years. The EU is alive and kicking. And the EU deserves that we, as members of the EU, are self-confident about our goals. And our goals, to respond to your question, include the inclusion of the Western Balkans. We said that in 2003 in Thessaloniki, and I think that is a valid promise. Point one. Point two.
Do you think, if I could just say, Brexit and the election of Donald Trump, have they made Europeans more conscious of how important the EU is?
I think the Brexit phenomenon will serve to reinforce our determination to make it happen. Look, there's a second element. In 2003, we said that because we thought this is the appropriate, historically speaking, response to the desire of the countries in the region. Today, it is still the response to the desire of the countries in the region, but it is also the response to our own determination of what our security requirements are. We do it not only because they want to come in, because we believe that it serves our security needs if they are inside the tent and not outside the tent. Right. For all the reasons that we don't have time to discuss, but you're all aware of that. And my third point would be, why is it so hard? Look, I mean, we have, in the course of EU enlargement procedures over the last decades, we have gone through a very difficult learning process. We learned, and I would say we learned the hard way, that if you don't pay close attention to every detail, you may import into your family, because that's what you're doing, a person who actually carries some kind of virus because he has an unsettled problem with your neighbor. And all of a sudden, you have an unresolvable issue with your neighbor. That, quite frankly, is what happened when we took in, with all great intentions, Greece. We underestimated that by taking in Greece, there was going to be a permanent, total inability of the European Union to deal with Turkey, or the Greek-Turkish dispute, because we had one of the parties to the conflict inside. So from that emanated the realization in our strategic approach, let's make sure that if we bring in a new family a new member into our family, let's make sure they come into the house with no outstanding issues. Mm. And that is why Chancellor Merkel, when she went to Belgrade a couple of years ago, I hope this was properly understood in Belgrade, she said, and I think she meant it, make sure your issues with Kosovo are resolved, because if they aren't, you're not going to make it into the EU. Mm-hmm. That is still our position. That is why it is harder to get into the EU than it is to get into NATO. Mm-hmm. In NATO, we can live with a country that has a certain unresolved issue with a neighbor. It's not nice, but we can live with it. In the EU, because it's such a close-knit family structure, it's destructive. And that's our lesson from the past, and that's why we need to take extra care to make sure that whoever comes in clean.
But even, I have to bring in Hungary now, because Kati Martin is here in the audience, and any discussion without Hungary is incomplete. But in some of the new members, in Hungary particularly, we've seen anti-democratic and xenophobic tendencies of late, and you have the curious situation where Serbia is receiving instruction in democratic norms on the far side of the EU border, and within the EU, right over the fence there in Hungary, you're seeing examples of the opposite. So that's problematic, isn't it?
Not nice.
Yeah.
Not nice. Let's assume the US were a member of the EU. Would we want to kick out the US because of the behavior of Donald Trump? Probably not. Yes. We would maybe I shouldn't have raised this question. But
a resounding yes from the audience. Let the record show.
Minefield. But what I'm trying to say is we would probably try to somehow work our way through this problem, and hope that at some point the United States, Hungary, whichever other
will
country,
come to their senses.
We had earlier cases. Remember, we took decisions, including sanctions, against this poor country, Austria, some 15 years ago, which, in retrospect, I think was too harsh a reaction.
You mean to Jörg Haider? Or?
Yes, because of Haider.
Yeah.
It only created a kind of Wagenburg mentality in Austria. You know, the entire EU is attacking us, so we've got to
stand together.
Stand together. We need to make sure that as we deal with Poland, with Hungary, with potentially other such cases, that we use, the best possible diplomacy, and we should do it in a way that creates an effect, but does not create a situation where even the opposition feels compelled to stand by the government because the guys in Brussels are attacking us. So this is a delicate thing. It requires Fingerspitzengefühl, if you know what I mean.
I do.
Yes.
Fingerspitzengefühl.
Works in English.
Genevieve, I'm going to throw this open to the audience soon, so if you have any questions, please think about the questions you would like to pose. Let me ask you a personal question, if I may. How do you prepare for Balkan diplomacy? I covered the Balkans I covered the war in Bosnia for a couple of years, and then I spent 2 or 3 years writing a book about the war after it and about the breakup of Yugoslavia. And frankly, I was driven crazy by the end by, I thought if I heard another reference to the Battle of Kosovo 700 years ago, a battle, incidentally, that the Serbs lost, but has nonetheless become their greatest national symbol. Or from Croats to the moment 1,000 years ago when they had an independent state. The Balkans, I think, has in common with the Middle East being trapped by history. History can enlighten, but it can also blind. So how do you go about dealing with the sensibilities in the Balkans? And do you ever grow impatient with the arguments that are made to you? And please be honest.
The first thing to be honest is that I work for the European Commission, so I'm responsible to prepare countries to be part of the European Union.
Yeah.
But the Balkan diplomacy is done by the European External Action Service, so that should be a question for my colleague Angelina Edgecourt, who couldn't be here tonight. But I suppose she will not mind if I said, of course we get nervous. We get nervous with our own selves as well. But I was in the region after the Kosovo conflict. And I have been working in other subjects that come back to the region just 1 year ago. The narrative has changed dramatically in the region. And I would like to start by saying, because you're painting a very bleak picture, the EU perspective is on the table. And it has been reconfirmed, starting by the meeting of all the member states in Rome, celebrating the 60-year anniversary of the European Union, that were clear that the door of the European Union is open. I can give you meeting after meeting of declarations, but just 2 weeks ago by President Juncker, that has been extremely forthcoming that this European Union will not have just 27 member states. So I think this is extremely clear. Let's not build anxieties into the systems that are not necessary. The perspective of the table is there, but of course, to become a member state, you need to meet certain requirements, and that is what needs to be done by the region and what the region is doing. It is clear that you said that at some points you were thinking about today in our meeting, you were jumping out of the bridges because you were so tired of that sort of dynamics in the region.
I did spend 6 years there, and there was a war, unlike today. So
absolutely, you were right to say that you were lucky that there were no bridges at the time to jump. But now we have bridges. We are building those bridges, both in.
I'm all for bridges. I like bridges.
In infrastructure terms, but as well.
I like bridges very much.
But not only in infrastructure terms, which are very much necessary, but in relationship terms. And I think when you talk about the leaders of this region, they're advising each other how to talk to the European Union, how to get to it. And you know why they do that? Because if you look at every of the leaders that are today in this region, they have been elected on the basis of EU integration tickets. You talk President Vučić, the first one. You talk about Prime Minister Rama. You talk about President Saeb. Those regions have been elected on that basis. And they know that the key to respond to those electorate is to work together. So the narrative has changed. dramatically in the region.
How has you said the narrative has changed dramatically. How is it? I didn't quite understand that. How has it changed?
Well, the narrative is exactly what Ambassador Ischinger was saying. I mean, they have realized that the European Union started with the CECA, with the community around energy. So we have now an energy community in the Western Balkans working together. They are following the same path that the European Union had after our wars in the European Union. And they realize, of course, you have spats here and there. Of course, it's a country full of passions, it's a region full of passion. Like I'm Spanish, I'm not afraid of that. I am as passionate as they are. But what is important is that if you realize those blurs of passion are just for domestic consumption purposes, they do 2 or 3 days, and then they restate the EU integration commitment, they start working together again.
So you think they're doing what Wolfgang hoped for, that the 6 of them are coming together with a united plan?
I mean, I think I would like
Alexander's
to ask Alexander
he's looking very skeptical.
to talk about that.
I mean, he wants Montenegro in and he doesn't care too much
it's
about
better than any of your talks.
That's not the truth. No, I'm just,
Come on.
First of all, she didn't tell us how they prepare for us, but she told you how we prepare to meet the Commission. So we talked to each other before going to Brussels, but it doesn't help a lot. And
what frustrates you most about your meetings with the European Commission?
It's maybe, unlike the Americans, there is not much straightforward talking.
Right.
And with the Americans, you always know what's on the table and what you are talking about. With the Europeans, it's all about very delicate procedures and mechanisms.
Technical terms.
Lots of technical terms, and then you know that the end of the road is after several weeks or months, after lots of negotiations, lots of energy spent. But of course, it's a complex kind of organism, and that's the EU even when you're inside, because it goes like that. But coming back to the individual approach against the regional one, just to be clear, Montenegro has nothing against regional cooperation itself. But the primary goal of the country is reaching the EU standards, reaching the single market, because we can open up to the food, let's say food products from Kosovo, from Albania, but in the end our road is leading us towards reaching the food safety standards of the EU. And we have been quite clear, it's joining the financial market of the EU, it's coming to the trans-European networks of the EU. And we see all this exercise in energy community or transport community that we just signed in Trieste as a kind of a helping hand in maybe exercising before we join the big union. And that's exactly where we maybe don't understand each other how this could be reached, because I feel that the countries cannot reach the EU at the same time unless somebody waits for somebody. Because the gaps are now
you don't really want to wait, right?
It's of course none of the country wants to wait. I mean, but you
think you'll be in the EU by when?
In the history of the enlargement.
By when do you think you'll be in the
EU? We
EU?
want to join in the next within the next financial perspective.
What's that mean?
That means starting 21.
2021 you want to be in.
That's the rough idea is that obviously you start with the next financial perspective because we should be in the multi-annual financial framework discussions now. The EU will need to understand starting from next year, whether there will be new member states starting from 21. And that's the idea.
Right. Well, I think we've had a tour d'horizon there. And we ended on a modestly optimistic note, maybe. But anyway, who has a question? There's a mic for, yes.
Kati.
Kati has a question. There's a mic, Kati. Yeah.
So it took the United States to end the last war in the Balkans, something that we can't count on if, God forbid, there's another war in the Balkans. If, for example, ethnic cleansing started, just for the sake of argument, in Hungary, let's say, the Trump administration would not mobilize the way the Clinton administration did to stop it. What would be the likely EU scenario, Wolfgang?
Well, I mean, You want me to respond, Roger?
I told you about Hungary, right? Yes, please.
Let's make sure we understand that Hungary is, of course, a full member of the EU. There are rules and regulations in the treaty which allow, when there are major violations of the rules of behavior, which allow the EU to take quite serious measures. In other words, against a member. That is different from how we would or could conceivably react to violations in non-member states. Let's assume there were a serious violation of behavior or a new war, as you said, in somewhere in the region. Would the European Union be capable of handling that? Well, let me put it this way. I think we would be in a slightly more capable position to deal with such emergencies, let's say in 2018, 19, et cetera, than was the case in 1995. But I would think, and this is why I continue to consider myself, not only because we sit in this house here today, an advocate of, in spite of Donald Trump, the closest possible transatlantic cooperation. I think this is one of the reasons why we think we need NATO. And we need a defense alliance. And it's great that Montenegro, even small Montenegro, is now a member of, NATO. Great. That's also useful for purposes of, hardware, defense, and external security. So, yeah, I think we can handle it, and we would. And and again, Roger, let me say, I really disagree with the notion that the EU doesn't like enlargement. We love enlargement. The European Union has benefited hugely from enlargement. I remember when this big enlargement round was coming, with Sweden and Austria, et cetera. Of course, what helped was that most of the citizens in the EU thought of Sweden and Austria as examples as obviously an asset. Nice and quiet countries with little debt and no wars going on, and why not? That is slightly different for the reasons we discussed, that Southeastern Europe has a bloody history and recent conflict. And that is why people are more worried. Is this a good idea or not such a good idea? In other words, we need to educate people, and the region needs to do whatever they can to make sure that EU members consider a future member like Montenegro an asset, a great addition to our family. And I think if we work together, that's possible.
Frank, you want to say something?
Well, I'd add one quick point before I make my modest intervention. First of all, Kati, thank you. But this is a great moment for me, and I'm sure everyone on the panel, to say how enormously proud we are to be here in this academy and in the memory of your husband, without whom this building wouldn't exist, this academy wouldn't exist, and we wouldn't be talking about a subject so intimately associated with his name, Bosnia. So, thank you. Having thrown a modest flower in your direction, I hope you won't mind if I just add a thought to what Wolfgang said. I think for all of us, the issue is unlikely to be, as you described it, Hungary sort of hurling people out. What do we really risk in the Balkans? What's really at stake? What should we worry about? Of course, there is Bosnia, where the institutions of this very fragile entity are rotting out, and where the communities are growing farther apart, and where we've already seen demonstrations. We could see an internal implosion in Bosnia which simple NATO troops don't deal with. Second, we're seeing now a period of prolonged economic stagnation throughout the region, producing huge amount of frustration. And what does that mean? It means the borders of this region of southeastern Europe won't contain the people who are frustrated. They'll be moving to your neighborhood. Third, we've seen trouble coming from the Middle East. We've seen ISIS rear its ugly head in the Balkans,
In Bosnia.
recruiting, and Kosovo,
yeah.
recruiting, infiltrating, taking advantage of the very, very difficult circumstances. So the real threats we face today are ones that require a combination of political intelligence, economic skills, and an intense degree of cooperation between Europe and the United States. Those are the real threats that keep me awake at night, and I think give us all reason to focus on this issue of bringing these countries, which are European and are already well on the way, the rest of the way into the Union.
Thank you for that, Frank. Very important points, I think. Genevieve wants to add something too. And then next question, Thomas, and then you. Yeah.
I wanted to add something which I think is important, that we pay tribute to the existing, deep, ongoing, consolidated cooperation we have with our transatlantic partners in the region. I mean, we all understand that it's probably not, the Western Balkans is not the subject of the tweets of President Trump, but the reality of the administration, the state administration, and the EU on the ground is that we work on a daily basis very closely together. So we should not be just looking at the fact that there might not be a lot of messages coming around this region, but the reality with Hoyt and with all his ambassadors, we really work hand in hand in this region, and we continue working hand in hand in this region. So I think that I would like to pay as tribute as well, because I don't want that the impression is that the EU is not present. The EU is very present in the Western Balkans, and is very supportive of this EU final destination for the region as a stabilization factor in the interest of the region, in the interest of the EU, and in the interest of the United States. And I would like just to mention, of course, the fact that now Montenegro, that Albania is part of NATO, is something which is very reassuring for the transatlantic architecture. And as a matter of fact, Albania is going to contribute troops now to Afghanistan. But I would like to go beyond that. You know, you have a country like Serbia, which of course not interested for the time being to be part of this, but they are contributing to the common foreign security policy missions of the European Union in the world. Everybody knows that Serbia is having a MiG or 2 or 3 coming from Russia, but not many people know that Serbia has troops on the ground with the European Union in the Gulf of Aden, helping us control piracy, that has troops on the ground in the Republic, the DRC, that we are preparing with the participation in battle groups of the European Union. And it's less known, but that is a very good, a very clear syndrome and symptom that this region is engaged.
Thank you, Genevieve. Yes, Thomas, you have a question, and then the gentleman behind you. Yeah, you might. Yeah.
I've lived in Paris for the past 6 years, and I'm just wondering, to what degree does religious diversity, specifically the presence of Islam, play in the decision to include or exclude the Balkan states in Europe?
Wolfgang.
Well, let me repeat. I think that looking at the strategic environment, looking at risks and dangers to our security today, there are only arguments in favor, of course, of including the Balkans in our in our family. We don't want opportunities for radicalism and extremism to be, to develop in an uncontrolled manner in a poor country that's left outside somewhere. In other words, if there were good arguments for the EU to invite the Western Balkans countries to become members in 2003, which is what we did, all the arguments become even stronger when I look at it from our own security interests today. So I see not a single reason why we should not do it. I see only reasons why we should do it. And look, in retrospect, sometimes this is forgotten. The United States, if I can speak on behalf of the United States, and European countries, when the Bosnian War started, were the allies of the Bosnian Muslims. We were the allies of the Bosnian. We tried to make sure that this community would not be overrun, diminished, destroyed, exterminated, as a matter of fact. In other words, our track record in the region is not one of, here we come, the Christians against the Muslims. We defended Muslim interests in Bosnia and in Kosovo. So we have a pretty good conscience. And this is what we should build on.
But I mean more European.
Mike, please, Mike. Yeah. Yeah.
European populations probably feel different than technocrats about that, no?
I think all of these issues can be explained. Good leadership can explain, and I think European citizens, certainly German citizens, are smart enough to understand that it is better to bring these Muslim or Orthodox or other communities into our community rather than to alienate them. This is obvious.
What about the counter
point.
argument that the ISIS cells are already in Bosnia or Kosovo, and so you're importing them?
We have enough ISIS cells here already,
Okay.
so it's not a good argument.
Okay. Yes, sir, you had a question, and then the lady behind you. Yeah.
Tom O'Donnell. I teach international affairs here. I just had I don't want to sort of hash out history, but I don't think it was so benign, the attitude the Americans took, my country took in the beginning, when, like in the very early, like 91. This was a time, I remember it just very different between Europe and America. As this was after with the war in the Middle East, when Milosevic around 91, it became very clear with a couple speeches he gave exactly what he was up to, and the American ambassador really, took a stand against him. In the Bush administration had been fighting to kind of reestablish and continue NATO, and the Europeans were very much against that NATO wasn't necessary. It was a big fight. And then there was the issues in the Middle East because of the war. And I think that there is an attitude in the White House that, fine, you guys think you can handle things without us? You handle this. And, the ambassador resigned and so forth. And now, the Clinton administration acted more honorably later, and we know this whole history.
But it took a long time.
Yeah, it took them a long time, even there. And that attitude still existed in Congress. I mean, they only allowed Wesley Clark to be in there right up until a certain point, then, okay, get him out, because of what he wanted to do. And I would just say, with these kind of divisions, it's between Europe and America at that time, it was, this is what happens, sort of. Not that it might not have happened anyways, but this is what happens. And it's a very dangerous situation now, notwithstanding I see your optimism, but for the same reason, I wouldn't doubt that people would play similar games when the opportunity arises. But I guess I'm asking, I'm sorry, it's a statement, I guess. I'm asking for your impressions.
No,
I remember some of this a little differently.
Well, I'm not sure I remember it differently than you do.
Yeah.
I was trying to make the argument that we are a reluctant player in the Balkans. We have been slow to the game. We played it with some vigor once we got on the field, but we also tended to leave the field earlier than we should. I'm arguing today that it is possible this administration can see its interests in the security of Europe in general, and this generation of military leaders, particularly people like General Mattis, General Kelly, General McMaster's, are all people who have seen war in this part of Europe, that they would be more lively to respond. But yes, I have no quarrel with what you said. The United States interest in the Balkans is derivative of a larger set of interests in Europe, not as directly involved as European interests are.
Yeah, I mean, if I may abuse the moderator's role for just a second. I mean, from April 1992 until August 1995, the Bosnian War was a chronicle of obfuscation and confusion between the United States and Europe. And I take Wolfgang's point, certainly. But nevertheless, the help that we tried to bring to the Bosnian Muslims for a very long time was ineffectual, as a result of which there was a genocide in Europe for the first time since World War II. And 100,000 people, most of them Bosnian Muslims, were killed. And the entire, and I witnessed this, the entire northern and eastern area of Bosnia was cleansed through concentration camps, not death camps, but concentration camps, of its entire Bosnian Muslim population. And of course, this is a shameful, in my view, chapter. And I think it's one lesson we learned was the enormous importance of trying to coordinate and get it right between. I mean, we're most effective when we work together and when we have clarity of purpose and direction, and that's why I think that continues to be, and your point is very well taken, very important going forward in ensuring that nothing like that, I don't see it on the horizon, but you know, that came out of nowhere. I mean, things do, like the fall of the Berlin Wall. I mean, you can't, the Arab Spring, I mean, these events are often very unforeseeable, despite all the punditry that I and others engage in. So, anyway, I'm not here to really speak, so excuse that. Yes, Madam. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. You discussed about the political development and the political and security goals. They are very important. Okay, of course, security from Europe depends on keeping peace in Balkans countries. But I'm missing to talk about money, economy. Without a strong economy and equality, I cannot see the possibility to reach those goals.
Alexander, you should probably come in on that. And I know you asked for money earlier, but I do think a big problem as seen from the European Union is, well, I mentioned the culture of dependency, but there's a perception of a lot of cronyism, of a lot of corruption, of a lot of politicians who are on the take. And how does the region dispel that impression? I believe that you really need, to this lady's point, I mean, you need to get to 6% growth a year. Yes. You're at 2 to 3% recently. So I'm not speaking specifically of Montenegro, maybe you're more, but taking the 6. So please answer this question. Other than by just saying we need more money, because I don't think, when money is given and there's a perception it goes to the wrong places, people grow skeptical of giving more.
Okay, so the question is just not money, of course, and the economy. It's also very much related to how the people perceive the region of the Western Balkans and why they leave it. So it leads us to another question of the social welfare and the system into which we have thousands of young people leaving the countries of the Western Balkans and coming to the EU. But we have also to take into account that this is a small region. It's 18 million people only. It's less than Romania. It's only 88 billion euro of GDP combined of the 6 countries. So we're not coming to such a huge sums, and something which would not be digestible by the EU in the sense of also offering a more kind of a better financial package to actually meet the demands of those, as I already said, the reforms that are taking root. But in the end, I also see that the European processes, as well as I said, NATO, is bringing also economic benefits, because the more you are integrated with the EU, obviously, the more you trade, the more you get accustomed to the way how the business is done in the EU. We just, for example, drafted the latest law, the company law, which is fully aligned with the EU. And obviously, for any European company that does business in Montenegro, it's crucial to have the same standards and values as it has in its own country. But also, it's about the rule of law, because the rule of law has a kind of it's very much connected to the investment and how the economy is growing. And the more we invest in the rule of law, obviously we'll get more investors because they will feel more secure. So it's a kind of a circle into which everything that we do, and I can assure that all of the countries, no matter how different they are on the level of integration, that there are so many things done. It's just the doing business list shows constant progress in all of the countries of the region, and that is a constant. Of course, we are not yet within the first 20 countries in the world, but obviously we are moving. And that is a kind of, I think, very much due to the fact that we are having European Union as a kind of a goal, and that is driving the whole of the reform processes.
Okay, last question. The gentleman there with the beard. I'm sorry, I think we have to close this down shortly. And Frank
Yes.
Wisner flew in today from the United States, so it's unreasonable to prolong the torture. Yeah, yes.
Good evening. My name is Adnan Çermekçek. I'm from European Stability Initiative. I have
You're from where, sorry?
From the European Stability Initiative, a think tank.
Yeah.
I have a question. The panel has focused quite a lot on the question when the countries will join. So I have a question for the Commission representative, and that is, how did you communicate the 2025 strategy and the speech of Mr. Juncker to the countries that are not included in the strategy? That means to Bosnia-Herzegovina, Macedonia, Albania, Kosovo. I just come from Sarajevo and Mostar, and I can tell you that the message, some parts of the politicians interested in status quo in Bosnia and Herzegovina, they've read the message as we have at least 2 electoral cycles before the EU gets serious with our country. And the parts of the political elites who are interested in change and in reforms and in getting Bosnia closer to the EU, they've read the message as it's still not serious from the EU side. So I'm wondering how the message is communicated and what's the purpose of now having this division within. And the second question is on how, and I think that's even more important question, is how to get these 6 countries to achieve the EU average on economy, education, rule of law, democracy standards, and all the other issues. And I was wondering about the issue of agriculture. It's not always about the money. If you think about the connectivity agenda and the Berlin process, the EU hasn't offered new funding for infrastructures for the countries, but it has offered a framework where the countries got in shape of being able to attract new investments in infrastructure by getting strategies and by being more attractive. So it's not always about the money, but money is important in agriculture, but it's also not severely important in areas such as education, for example. So how is also another question.
Well, Genevieve, I'm sure you can cover that in 2 minutes. So the status quo politicians, maybe pro-Russian politicians, felt that they're now free to do their worst, thanks to the EU Commission's message. So what do you say to that?
I think the message has to be read in a different way. This message is a message of hope for the whole region. The whole region has a EU perspective. It is a fact that there are 2 countries, which is Montenegro and Serbia, which are negotiating with us. So, of course, they are the forerunners in this process. But if you are running in this regatta approach that we have, that every country advances on its own merit, that means that if we open that window for the ones that are running, the ones that are behind can catch up. And nobody knows if in the future other countries that will start negotiating during this perspective 25 will run faster than the ones that are already in the race. So the message is clear. It's a message of hope to the whole region, and it's an incentive to the whole region to really don't pay us lip service on the reforms, but to do them, because the window of opportunity is there. So we have been very clear that that interpretation, which is always the interpretation of the bottle half empty, should be read as a bottle half full. So that is first. The second thing about money, there is a lot of money in the region. Of course, it's never enough, and I agree that the more we can bring to the region, the better for the region and for the EU. But, I mean, let me give you a figure. From 2007 to 2017, the EU will be putting in the region 10 billion euro. So the attention in financial terms that the EU gives to the Western Balkans is incomparable to any region of the world. So money is there. How do we use that money to make it more having better impact in the reforms that need to be done and accompanying the growth is a different thing. But I want to say the difficulties that the region has are not different to the difficulties that a country I know very well has. In Spain, we have 40% of youth unemployment. It's very similar to the regional average in many aspects. So what I want to say, there's never simple solutions to complex problems. So what we have to do is continue working together, doing the necessary reforms, bringing the necessary investments, which I agree with you, and there's a misunderstanding. There's 1 billion euro on that connectivity agenda. And certainly the fact that we have that 1 billion will leverage 5 or 6 billion more from the IFIs, because we can put the grant funding necessary to bring the loans. So this is already in the pipeline. That is not enough. I agree that there are enormous amount of needs in the region. I agree as well. But it has not been, nobody can say that there's no willingness on the European Union not to tackle those problems. I mean, those problems, we have them in the EU and we don't have solutions. So we have, if we had a miracle recipe to address youth unemployment, it would not be a problem in Greece, in Italy, in Spain, in Portugal, in many of our member states either. We have common problems, we have common challenges, and certainly working together we have better chances to find solutions.
Thank you. On that hopeful note, I see more questions out in the audience. I'm very sorry. I apologize to those who are unable to ask a question. If you'd like to ask one of the panelists individually afterward, I'm sure they wouldn't mind. Thank you to all the panel. Thank you to all of you, and good night.